This is Joseph Trevino for FX Solutions and FX Street. I thank you all for attending. I hope it will be instructive and promote some thoughts. Our topic today, can China support the world, is not a direct FX topic in the sense that you can't trade the yuan, but as I've noticed on some of the comments earlier on the board, it certainly has enormous implications, even if you're not trading the yuan, for world currencies, for the world markets. So let us step back a bit. This is not meant to be a specific economic comparison, and it is not meant to be an inquiry into the veracity of Chinese economic statistics. This has been discussed before with us and with others. It's not a topic that has a great deal of validity is not correct. It has a great deal of validity in that there are serious reasons for questioning Chinese statistics, but you don't have a lot of options. You go directly from the official Chinese statistics to anecdotal evidence, and that is a very large gap. So let us not dwell upon that today, although I will touch upon it today. I think probably the most instructive way to start is to view the Chinese and the American competition in a historical sense. There's a very good essay back in February by Robert Samuelson, who, surprisingly enough, considering his quality and a political bent, at least from his economic writings, writes for Newsweek. In a historical sense, and I don't mean 10 years or an election cycle, I mean the historical sense, the historical evolution and competition of cultures and of nations. We have a much shorter time span, of course, than China. In the history of our nation, the United States, as an organized, independent entity from 1776 on, if you will, or 1781 or 1789, that existence coincides with an ahistorical period in Chinese history. I will be glad to answer. I prefer to do this, as you all know, as a discussion rather than a lecture. Is their economy communist or capitalist? The economy is partially state-controlled capitalist. There are elements of an older sort of communist organization principle in that many entities are still owned by the government in China and perform poorly. But the dynamic section of the economy, the section of the economy that has given China its world role, is capitalist. The government has very little to do with Western-style democracy that we tend to think goes hand in hand with capitalism. That, in fact, is historically not true, and it's not true in the current world either. It is quite possible, China's the best example there is, to have an authoritarian government and a capitalist system. So we have to be careful of our assumptions of tying politics to economics and an economic system. And China is not the only example of a capitalist, as a thoroughly capitalist country, although it's not completely, thriving under an authoritarian government that is clearly not democratic. And there are plenty of democratic governments that have made messes of their capitalist economies. We can think of a good portion of Southern Europe that falls into that category. If you are looking at a successful capitalist country, would you use as an example Greece, which is clearly democratic, or China? But back to the topic. In the organized history of the United States, 200 and some odd years, a few more, the Chinese government and the Chinese country and culture has been historically in that period weak, but ahistorically weak. China has had other periods in her economy, primarily the Warring States period. I am not a China expert or a China historian, where the country has been disorganized for 100 or 200 years, where there is no central government controlling the country. This has been the case for most of the modern history of Western capitalism. For the past 200 years, if you state the beginning of the West's dominance actually goes back to the Renaissance, perhaps, and to the voyages of exploration in the late 15th and 16th centuries that led to colonial empires and the rest. That is really the historical period of an increasing Western domination of the world economy. For the 200 years that China, up until 1949, had been disorganized, and honestly, we'd probably make it up to 1980, because China's internal organization after the communist success in the Civil War in 1949 did not really have any substantial economic effect throughout the world until China began to capitalize its economy around 1980. So the West, the Western-dominated economic system, which since the Second World War has both been dominated, protected, and led by the United States, I see that comment there, that the Chinese economy is capitalist in micro details, but communist in macro structure. I'm not sure I agree with that. Partially that's true, and partially it's not true. When you're thinking macro structure, there are very large new corporations in China that are not beholden to, as organizing principle, to communist organization principles as far as how they function in the Chinese economy. Yes, of course, they have to do what the cadres in Beijing tell them. It is very important to have influence and to function within that system. But it seems to me now that the system is functioning far more as a authoritarian, partially state-directed system than it is in a communist sense, that you have new companies and the dynamic companies forming on communist organization principles. Yes, the communists are in power. They call themselves communists, but they certainly have zero devotion to communist principles. I frankly consider the current government in Beijing rather a new Chinese imperial dynasty. With many of the structures, Mao had great aversion and antipathy towards traditional Chinese culture. One of the prime reasons behind the Red Guards and the Cultural Revolution was to eradicate some or most of the traditional Chinese culture's existence in China, which Mao thought was thwarting the true agrarian proletariat revolution. Well, he was unsuccessful. The Chinese remain Chinese. They remain culturally Chinese and far more traditionally Chinese than would be viewed from the outside. In many ways, you're correct. And just one example, Chinese corporate tax is far lower than here in the United States. There are many things that the Chinese government does that are less capitalist, or more capitalist. The support system, social welfare system, despite it being an ostensibly communist workers' paradise, is far less supportive of the individual than here in the United States, and certainly than in Europe. So you can make many, many arguments, which are actually very interesting, that China is more capitalist than the United States. But back to the historical point of view. So for the history of the modern industrial West, since 1800 or 1750, you'd like, when the West has clearly dominated the world militarily, politically, and economically. China has been, in its view, ahistorically weak. The only China we know in the United States as a political actor has been, relatively speaking, a weak, and maybe except for the Korean War and currently some of its influence in North Korea, remains a relatively inconsequential actor in the political and military field. Not so economically, of course, and becoming less so far politically, but certainly militarily. China is in no way threatening the U.S. dominance and hegemony in the Pacific. So from an organizational point of view, from an international political point of view, China has not been on the international stage in any way, any large way, for more than 200 years. This is the China the West is used to. This is not the China as China conceives itself. I don't think it's the way the cadres in Beijing conceive themselves. They know certainly that in order to continue the growth that they have so successfully sponsored in China, in their country, they will need to take a larger and larger position on the world stage, and I think they're planning on doing that. Certainly, if you look at their military spending, it would seem to indicate that's where they're headed. But I don't think that's true also of the Chinese people. From what I know from some of my travels there, their view is much closer to that of a 2,000-year-old culture that has given the West many of its inventions and technological developments. But more importantly than that, it is an organized entity of culture that goes back 2,000 years, and I think this is a very important and also meaningful fact to the majority of Chinese people. If you looked at its approach to the world, its approach to the world is not essentially internationalist. It is essentially China first. You know, there's always that Churchill's comment about Russia, a riddle wrapped inside a mystery, inside an enigma, and the quote always stops there. The quote goes on to say, but perhaps there is a key. That key is Russian national interest. That's exactly the correct way to view China. And I don't know why this is always such a puzzle as it seems to be, as portrayed in the media. China's interests are discernible, they are national, and they are changing. But viewed through the Chinese lens, viewed through what is necessary for China and Chinese own internal historical concerns, the projection of Chinese power out into the world is both predictable and understandable. Simply because the West has not seen in its recent 200-year industrial memory an entity anywhere in the world that could compete with it economically does not mean that the Chinese can, which they can, and they will, which they most certainly are. Although there was a very profound and dangerous political and military competition with the Soviet Union, certainly for the 50 years or the 40 years after the Second World War, there was never an economic competition. And there's a lesson in that. More than any other reason for the failure of the Soviet Union, well, let me not pretend to be an expert in that as well. One of the reasons for the failure of the Soviet Union was the collapse of their economy. Their economic system could no longer support the types of expenditures that their official politics and ideology demanded. In addition, the repressions of the system on its own people had abrogated almost every bit of loyalty to the central government. When the Russian Empire fell, there was no one there among its own people, or very few, to defend it. China is in a different situation, and the United States is also in a different situation. What the Chinese are giving their people is economic growth and wealth. They're not pretending to do anything else. Their concerns domestically in China by the government are for stability, internal stability. The United States' concerns are quite different. There's no question here, at least so far, and I really mean that facetiously, of internal stability in the United States. But what the United States needs for its economic future, and one that it has supported with its national power in all of the years, really, since the turn of the century, but certainly since the Second World War, has been international stability. The United States, as the leading Western democratic capitalist and most powerful country, operated in a world trading system very much directed, controlled, and to its benefit. It does not appear that way, perhaps, from the United States, but it is often viewed that way from the rest of the world. Perhaps maybe not so much from Europe, which has thrived under our protection and within that system. Certainly when Russia was still, the Soviet Union was still in existence and a threat. But there was and has been really no competitor to the United States. I know I'll hear that Japan did for a while, and that's true. And although Japan was a competitor in a very narrow economic sense, it was never a competitor that would rise from economic competition to political and military competition, and it never did. In fact, now the Japanese economy has been moribund for so many years, and their population is declining, that they are becoming less of a factor in the world political system than ever. China, it's a very different case. China's economic development will most certainly sponsor political and military growth as well. In order to maintain its growth, its dominance internally, but the competition within the world economic system. Part of this is cyclical, and part of it is based on political and economic competition. Thinking cyclically, as the United States largely replaced Britain, one of the reasons that this was the case, not the only one certainly, was that the U.S. was in those days a developing nation. So much of its development was internal. Think of railroads in the 19th century and the vast expansion of U.S. industry. Most of that was made to serve a domestic market. You are seeing a similar type of evolution in China. It is large enough to be semi-autarkic. Love that word. Autarkic just means the economy is not really connected to the rest of the world. Its development and sales and investment is focused almost exclusively internally. It is a descriptive term. It's not meant to be any type of development model. The few places that have proclaimed it as a development model, North Korea in particular, have been robust failures to the detriment of their people and really to the detriment of the entire world system. That's true. Nevertheless, the possession of a large internal market is one of the strengths of a pre-imperial power. Certainly one of the ideas behind the British Empire was that Britain had a relatively small population. And it ended up with, in many ways, a large captive market in its colonies. So back to the historical view. We are now in a period where the change in political power, remember, political and military power, often the sine qua non, without which nothing for these to take place, is economic power. There have been a few instances, and they're rare, where a country that does not now have great or did not have great economies had a far greater impact on the world. I'm thinking of perhaps 18th century Prussia, which was a small country, but due to the dominance of its military, had an outsized influence in that period in European history. But those instances are rare. The base for military and political power is economy. And that is the base that China is now building on, and it is unfortunately the base that is being hollowed out in the United States by its political rulers. It is no doubt a coming competition between the United States and China that will dominate the next, I would say, 25 to 50 years of world history. China's influences, China's need in the world is not necessarily the same as the United States. The congruence of international desires between, say, the United States and Britain, you could say the United States and Japan, the United States and France, is very, very strong. If ELF is competing, or Total is competing against ExxonMobil for an oil contract, nevertheless, it is still, all those companies, European or American, are still competing for an oil contract underneath the protection of United States political and military power. Sometimes ExxonMobil will win, sometimes ELF or Total will win. That is very different than the competition that is currently happening and will continue to happen between the United States and China. My view, and Mr. Samuelson's view also, which is where I got this from, is that China's interest. Wait a minute, we've got some interesting stuff going on here. Hold on. Yeah, there's an interesting idea about this. China has had many years of ages of the world history where you could say it was the dominant power. It was the most organized, it was the biggest, it had the most advanced culture and technology. That is undoubtedly true. But the difference in China's imperial history is that China's direct political influence almost always extended into the interior of China rather than outward into the world. I mean, there are parts of, certainly of Vietnam, which would, the Vietnamese might make an argument this was not true, that China did invade Vietnam a number of times. But by and large, China did not extend its political system and its influence out into Asia and into the world. Yes, its cultural dominance was very strong and very widespread, but not its political dominance. The Chinese did not end up, except of course if you speak to the people of Western China, with a colonial system. Britain was a tiny nation, relatively speaking, and it ended up dominating by 1900 a quarter of the global political. China, in its years of organization and strength, did not attempt such a, political development. So it doesn't really have the tradition or the mindset of a projection of power out into the world. China, of course, as we all know, calls itself the Middle Kingdom, or did. That doesn't mean it's halfway between Mongolia and Vietnam. It means it's between heaven and hell, essentially. It is the center of life on the planet. So that mindset, really, or as the famous, I think it was the Chinese emperor in the 18th century, Qianlong, said when the McCartney mission from Britain went there, it might have been in the 19th century, I'm not sure, probably late 18th century, came offering trade and Western goods, his response was, "We do not need your goods. We have everything that we need already." That also is a traditional Chinese attitude. So you have these attitudes now operating within a government and within a system now to keep its position internally within China must do something that China has never really done, and that is exercise influence far afield from Asia. The Chinese are absolutely doing that. They're looking specifically for commercial advantages, for commercial treaties. When the Chinese send commercial delegations to Asia, to Africa to look for minerals or to buy up contracts, they are essentially doing so underneath the American control of the world system. Meaning, if Chinese freighters are going to go to Africa and bring back minerals, they're not able to do that because the freedom and peace of the oceans is guaranteed so far by the Chinese Navy. They're able to do so because the international system, the international naval system, is guaranteed by the United States Navy. So China does have interests in the maintenance of the international system as it is. The question that comes up is, will the increasing need for China to secure these types of contracts and to affect itself in the world excuse me, bring it into conflict with the United States' control of, if nothing else, the world shipping lanes? In addition, for how long will the United States be able to guarantee this world system when the United States can't pay for it? And the United States cannot pay for it. China is paying for it. So in a sense, China's support of the U.S. budget deficit does two roles. It's a very cheap way of guaranteeing the world world military system, which benefits China's trade, and until it's ready to take over, it hollows out the United States. It permits the United States government in Washington to spend far more than it earns, meaning that at some point, when the Chinese decide, or the world credit system decides, that support for the fantasies of the Washington government on economics will be withdrawn. And then the United States will no longer be in the position of guaranteeing the world's trade system, as some might say, to its own benefit, but certainly to the benefit of a very small amount of controversy and physical and actual warfare, if you will. So China's interest here is currently largely allied, I think, with that of the United States. I do not think that that will continue. So let us look at some of the facts. That's the historical background on China. I know one of the favorite topics these days is China manipulating their yuan. I'm going to show you a graph, this one right here, and everyone should tell me what they think. This is the graph of a managed currency. China is most certainly manipulating its currency. It may be doing so because it thinks it's in its best interest, and I suppose we sort of have to let the Chinese give them at least an advantage in saying that they know that they know their own situation best, and that if they judge it this way, then they have. But this is certainly a managed currency. There's no question about it. It's managed towards China's advantage. And if it is not the sole or maybe even the largest source of U.S. Trade deficits, that's probably more to do with the balance of spending in the United States as opposed to savings. Nevertheless, it most certainly has shipped jobs, business, and money to China. The Chinese view the international system as competition, and they think that this is a perfectly acceptable method of competing. Their counter to the United States would probably be that the rest of the world economic system has been built and maintained by the United States for its own advantage. In a different sense, perhaps, but certainly true. So China's role, as far as the yuan goes, is clearly, in this graph, only going to change when the Chinese find that it is in their benefit. Let's look at some more graphs here. Not that one. Let's look at this one. Okay, we just did that. Sorry, I'm not sure where these are. Whoops. This is, interestingly, a graph of the Chinese. This is the Shanghai Exchange. Great bubble in 2007 and 2008. You can see it compares very well in direction and the time with the Western, especially the United States. However, look at the difference in range. The peak in China was almost 6,000. It went down below 2,000. And now it has picked up back to about 3,000. So the comparison to that is right here. This is the Chinese interest rate. There's about a 3% difference right now between the lending and deposit rates. Deposit rates is 2.5%. Well, as far as learning Chinese, My kids, I have two 2-year-old girls, and they're well, a little bit more than two now. They're studying Chinese, but I don't think they're very happy with it, so I think we're going to stop. And I don't think they're studying very much anyway. This is a chart of the Chinese interest rate. Their central bank did almost the same thing that the American central bank did. So clearly the Chinese system is operating within the world, and they are trying to use the same types of monetary and fiscal controls that operate in the West. They're ideograms. They're not pictograms. They're a little bit different, but at a time, one of Mao's ideas, I think in the 60s, was to get rid of traditional Chinese written language and to move China entirely to a pinyin system. Pinyin is the Western language, English actually, transliteration really of Chinese phonetics into Western language, into English. And there was such resistance that he dropped the idea, but he did want to do that for a while. The prior system is Wei Giles. Okay, so where is China now as far as its economy, and can the Chinese economy carry the world in any sense that the rest of us can all depend on it? Whether or not it's a good thing is another story, but whether or not it can actually carry it off. In my opinion, from the totality of the world economy, no, of course that's not true. If you got a collapse in so many other places, China would not be able to carry forth or to do anything like support the world economy. It does not buy enough from the rest of the world, and it's not a wealthy enough country. And it does not yet have the type of consumption. In general, world industry is considerably overbuilt. Too many cars are made. Too many DVD players. Well, now I suppose there are less DVD players. Everyone is trying to do the same thing. And industry has expanded, because it provides jobs, much more than world consumption. The U.S. is no longer carrying this role, and it was not actually good for the United States when it did. China has not yet taken over that role. Japan never moved into that role, and that's one of the problems with its economy. It never moved substantially from the export model. China, I think, and the rulers in China, I think, not having spoken to them, I was not invited to the Central Committee meeting when I was in Beijing in the springtime, or in the early summer, so I can't speak for them. And I will say that, although I did not view the embalmed body of the great leader, it certainly seemed to be a very popular tourist attraction amongst the Chinese. The lines in Tiananmen Square were astonishing by 9 or 10 o'clock every morning, and they were all Chinese. So I had a limited amount of time. I did not get on the line to go visit to view the great chairman in his permanent state. But it is a great tourist attraction in Tiananmen Square in China. So, China cannot currently, in my view, carry the world. But what it can do, and what it certainly has done, and from our point of view with traders in currencies, commodities, those markets, it is and perhaps the most compelling force right now. I saw a comment earlier about Aussie. The Australian and the commodity currency, particularly the Aussie, yes, I saw that about becoming a province of China. Not quite. But their economy and their currency depends very much on what happens in China. And so far, if we look at the figures in China, so let's do that now. Let's take a look with an idea of this. Looking at some of the statistics out of China and to see whether or not there's enough strength or validity there as far as much as we can. I agree with that. I do not think the Chinese are going to float the yuan. The advantages that they have, systems and ways of looking at the world become ossified in almost any ruling party or any ruling class. The Japanese were never able to move their system, dominated as it is by the political class, away from the export model, and now they suffer for it. There's certainly a potential in China for the same type of stultification within the Chinese economy, that it doesn't move away from the export model to an internal development model. Now, the Chinese government has proven remarkably adaptable and remarkably clear-eyed and successful in developing its economy. So on this topic, I would have to at least give them some benefit of the doubt that they do understand and will not take the Japanese role as a model. However, if you look at some of the figures, and you certainly look at some of the domestic consumption figures within China, they do not give you that type of confidence. In the last 5-year plan, and yes, they do have 5-year plans, the development of domestic consumption was one of the goals. They fell quite woefully short of that in the actual achievements. However, you can make an argument that it was the recession and the world financial collapse that took them out of that model, or at least out of that immediate model, because they felt they had to save the system and make sure they saved jobs, avoided internal disputes, internal riots, the things that do scare and the way traditionally Chinese governments are replaced, and so they can move back to that when they need to. So let's look at some of these figures that we see out of China. The most recent thing that happened in China was on last Friday, I think, the Chinese raised their... Well, we have an intern, in addition to what I'm saying, I can see that there is looks like a very lively discussion going on amongst the attendees to the webinar on the history and many other things. So let's take a look at some of these. I think you can all see them. Bringing back the pound to reserve currency, I like that one. Let's talk to the Brits about it and see if they have any interest in that. My guess is they probably don't. I don't think the yuan is going to become the world reserve currency anytime soon, and there's a very good reason for it. The current Chinese development is benefited by their manipulation of the currency, and they would lose that if they became a world reserve currency. They would gain other advantages, as the United States has them, but the main advantage that the United States has now is that it gets to fund its deficit, and I don't think the Chinese consider that an advantage or one that they need to pursue right now. I think they would give up too much of their control if they permitted it to become a fully convertible currency right now. And in fact, it would probably cause enormous dislocations. It would, in fact, probably cause enormous dislocations to their economy if they did that. So I would not look to China actually ever becoming a world reserve currency, and there's one basic reason. The Chinese have an authoritarian system, and I don't see the rulers in Beijing giving up control of that essential item of their economy. That may be a bigger impediment to China ever actually doing something like that than anything else. I think China would have to evolve politically before it would be able to do that. After all, the world currency markets don't always do what national governments want. We're used to operating within that system. Remember, though, this system only goes back to the early 70s. Before that, there were fixed rates. The Western countries have two problems. One, they can't figure out, they're not happy with the current floating rates, but they don't see any alternative that wouldn't be worse. And even if they did, they can't figure out a way to get from here from there. So there is no agreement on anything that could replace the world current system, which is why we have it. And two, there really isn't any idea what could replace it. Going back to a gold system is not going to work. All of the things that have been tried in the past are simply not going to work. We're here for lack of the ability to be any place else rather than any planning system that got us here. But then by and large, that is also the history of the evolution of capitalism. It is not planned, by and large, by governments. It is created by the people, more or less. And so that's where we are now as far as the world trading system. It's interesting that it is probably far more capitalist now in the sense of less control than it ever has been. So look at some of these other comments here, and then we'll look at some figures, and then I'll let you all go. So let's see what we have here. Yes, interesting comments you guys are having here. One of the things that the Chinese have done, in a small way, I mean, there's an article I've seen in Bloomberg here that that on the MISEX, the Russian exchange, the Chinese renminbi is now trading directly against the ruble. Would you like to hear some of the volumes? This was on, I guess it was yesterday. No, it's today. So the ruble closed at, this is a Bloomberg story. The ruble closed at 46.3405 per 10 Chinese yuan at 11 a.m. in Moscow after opening at 46.35. Want to hear what the volume was? The volume was 4.92 million yuan, or $738,000. That's it. $738,000. The Russian exchange expects, says Vice President Igor Matic, a daily volume of about 3 million yuan. You know how much that is? $450,000. There isn't going to be any great rush to the yuan as an instrument of international trade. Now, the Chinese have opened it up in some sense. You can actually, if you trade with China, buy and sell in yuan, hold external yuan accounts, and therefore avoid the translation. But in fact, it is not. Well, the reason for this, let me answer that. The reason that the Chinese are doing this is not so that it can be a freely traded currency, but to simply make it more efficient as a trading entity, rather than going through something else. That's the reason for doing it, to facilitate trade and to make it easier, rather than to have a freely traded entity. So the fact that you're right, the fact that you hear out there that yuan is the next reserve currency is by and large nonsense. In order for people to feel comfortable investing in a currency, they have to feel that they're not going to be screwed in some fashion or other by the national government holding the currency. Countries that have manipulated or devalued their currency, and there are many around the world, are not countries and currencies in which people choose to hold value. Whatever you want to say about the United States and its currency regime here, by and large, the U.S. has not manipulated its currency. So the U.S. does function as a store of value, and probably still the standout store of value in the world. Whenever I'll be glad to talk about that. Whenever, just take a look at your Euro charts over the past 3 years. Whenever things get excitable in the world economy, everybody floods into the United States. And that remains to be the case. If there were, say the yuan, the Chinese suddenly opened up they developed immediately overnight an internal bond market, and you could buy Chinese treasuries. Would anybody do so? Would world money managers do so? Would anyone trust the Chinese government to live up to the responsibilities of that, aside from the needs of their own economy? And I think the answer would be no. Is it also true that there will be, over the next 10 years or more, an inevitable increase in the value of the yuan? I would say yes. Okay, let me look at some of these comments here. Comments on BRIC. Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Brazil, relatively well-run country recently. Internal problems, an enormous, the poster child pretty much for income disparity. Brazil has gotten a lot of press. Certainly the economy and the real have appreciated due to the strength of the economy and Lula's government, which has been very successful. But spend some time on local Brazilian stories, and you'll see that the internal problems in the country are still enormous. Primarily wealth distribution. They have taken the approach, surprisingly enough, under Lula, as viewed from his past history as a labor organizer and a labor leader, that they will be more successful, as China has, the same view, by growing the economy, by creating wealth, rather than attempting to overtly redistribute what is there. Obama administration, take note. Brazil is relatively well placed, I think, due to the size of its internal market, and I would consider that a long-term positive in currencies and also in economies. Russia, I have my serious doubts about the internal strength of the Russian economy, about the political system there, and about its ability to do more if the world actually gets away again from a resource-dominated economy. What do I mean? Let's take this example. Remember that bit about cold fusion about 10 years ago? Some academic in the United States supposedly discovered cold fusion. Unless source of fusion energy could do away with, so much of the world's dependence on oil and coal for power and mode of transport. Well, had that turned out to be true, and if the world were busily building now cold fusion plants, where would Russia be? Russia would be nowhere. I don't think the Russian development beyond the resource economy seems to have much promise. So I would not view Russia or the ruble as a long-term positive. India, I definitely would, both the country and the, what do we have there, the rupee. India's political system has proven to be astonishingly durable. It has suffered far more from terrorism than any other major country really in the world. It has not lashed out. It has focused and stayed within its system and within its worldview. Its development is uneven. It has enormous wealth distribution problems, but it seems to be there as well, especially under Mohammed Singh's government, that its approach is a developmental approach. It's an approach that the Brazilians are taking and the Chinese are taking. Create wealth. Let your citizens create and grow your country. and the effects will not only be good economically, but they will be more stable politically. And I think that's so I would be bullish both on the rupee and on the Indian government and economy over the next generation. They have some of the same advantages that Brazil and India and China have, and that the United States had in the 19th and early 20th century. A booming and developing internal market, both for structural improvements, the creation of infrastructure, and for the creation of a consumer economy. If people, you have the virtuous cycle of wealth, creating jobs, or investment, creating jobs, creating wealth, creating consumption, creating more jobs. Because all three of those countries have very large populations and very large poor populations, the potential is still very large there. And it can generate internally. In the U.S. and in Western Europe, these are largely satiated consumer societies. I, in fact, would like to buy a bigger SUV. I have a RAV4, which works well in New York, but with twins, I need a larger car. But that's the type of improvement that you might find now in the United States. It's not an entire 200 or 300 million people as you have in China and India looking to do the same thing. So those are structural advantages that have to do with growth and development that have accrued to all of those countries. The only one that I would leave out on that one is Russia, for reasons that I've spoken. In addition, Russia has a declining population. Now, interestingly enough, China is also going to have a declining population very soon. Its one-child policy has skewed the population and is going to start diminishing the population. In China, the skew between male and female is something like 120 to 100 or something, a very, very out of the normal curve skew because of their years of one-child policy. Even though the policy is not uniform and not enforced everywhere, it is nonetheless a real policy and has had its effect. Commodity prices. Oh, the next speaker's waking. Wow, it's 12 o'clock already. Sorry, folks. Let me just make one comment on commodity prices. There's not been a lot of inflation imported back into the United States. If you saw by the way, folks, I apologize, as usual with me. I did not get to all of the statistics that I meant to get to illustrate some, I think, of the vulnerabilities of the Chinese economy. Wary of China. It is stronger than perhaps its doubters say, but it is in many ways a fragile economy, and if the world does not continue to improve, China will be in a serious presentation. On commodities, the U.S. inflation was out today, and it was less than expected. So the problem with commodity pricing leading back into inflation in the United States, that even if it does so, it will be in a relatively small way because there are restrictions on demand. I'm getting chided by Maud, so I thank you all very much for attending. I hope, although it was a little bit off topic, I hope it was useful. You can reach me, and I'll put it up there at joet@fxsol.com. Thank you, Maud. Thank you, FX Solutions, and thank you, FX Street. And we will see you all, as they say, in the new year. Be well, everyone, and if you're around New York, be warm. Take care.